Previously on the first step. Our roguish rapscallion paints himself some poorly articulated potatoes. And then things get really crazy. He begins to throw down incoherent blobs of paint and even adds feathers to his potatoes. Want to find out what happens next on this crazy and poorly structured still life? Stay tuned for the first step. Hello and welcome once again to the first step. My name is Gary Labe, and today we will be wrapping up my image of Healing Touch. So last week we started rendering out forms and adding color, and this week we will be adding final details and trying to fix this thing that is slowly becoming a hot mess. So this week we are going to be focusing our attention primarily on the owl and some foreground elements, as well as doing a little bit of color balancing. Last week when we left off, I realized that the owl itself stopped looking like an owl, or like the owl I really wanted it to be, and started to look more like a really fat, weirdly colored pigeon. So this week we're going to spend some time and really render out the forms and add a lot of detail and try to find the character that I wanted the owl to originally have. So I wrestled with this character's boots a lot, just trying to find out how they're going to fit on his body. Even at the end piece, I'm still not completely happy with them, but overall, when the piece is finished, I'm happy. So, yeah, I probably could have explored it a little bit more, but I was sort of on a deadline, so I just wanted to get it done, and the end result is better than just that tiny little detail. And speaking of details, I just wanted to give a little tip. When you get to the stage of your painting where you're starting to flesh out your image and really add those fine little details, like the feathers overlapping the straps here in this image, that you consider how those details add to the character, add to the story of your image, and it's not just ornamentation for the sake of ornamentation. So try to consider details that will add story to your story. So here's where I go into the image and start to reshape the character of the owl by using the liquefy tool to try to manipulate the body into more of what I had in my mind when I first started this piece. I spent a lot of time noodling the eye and the head, and then I'll eventually add more to the feathers to try to emphasize the owlness of the owl. But again, I had stopped looking at my reference at some point, and when I looked back at it after a while, I realized, oh my god, I was way off base. And so yeah, now I'm referencing the image that I'm using pretty severely in order to make sure I can get this character across. So yeah, make sure if you're using reference that you use the references as much as you can. Don't use it as a crutch, but if you know you're off base, then make sure you refer back to what you're using for reference. Right about here, I start a color layer and try to push back the saturation of that green, and then I'll slowly reintroduce a little bit more color to those trees. I'm trying to find a little bit more muted tones in order to be able to emphasize some of those saturated tones a little bit later in the piece. So as you may have noticed, I'm not working on too many layers on this as in previous videos. Whenever I get to a certain point, I'll compress or flatten all the layers and then make a duplicate and paint on top of that. And so I'm not labored by too many layers and trying to figure out what goes where, or separating out the figures. Sometimes I will if I have a super complex background. I'll have the figures on one layer and then the background on another. But in this piece, I just painted over everything, and then anything that got I don't know, accidentally painted over, I would just go back in and repaint it. I didn't hold anything to high regard, or you know, nothing was kept sacred as I was painting. So in most of my work, everything is subject to change at a moment's notice. So I just go in and paint on single layers and then flatten them out when I'm happy. This here is a good example of a failed experiment on my part. I was trying to create the illusion of sun shining through the canopy above and hitting the branches, so you sort of see blotches of sun here and there, and I kept trying to find the right leaf brush in order to successfully make that happen, but it just wasn't working so well. So even though I kind of kept it, I still painted over it a little bit and then reduced the opacity so it wasn't as obvious. But yeah, I tried for a while to get that to work, and I still don't think it turned out completely how I had in my head. So right about here, I flatten the image and I use the lasso tool to cut out the gnome, and then I drag him down just a little bit so that he's not on the same exact plane as the owl. It sort of give it a little bit more dimension, or a little bit more depth of field. It looked like he was standing pretty much on the same plane as the owl, and it didn't look right. So again, another example of how things change at a moment's notice. And then I'm also going to go in and change his legs too, because it looks like they are on the same plane as well. So I'll try to fiddle with those a little bit down the line. At this point, I decided I needed to introduce the main foreground element that I wanted, and what it was going to be was just a bed of leaves, but in the extreme foreground to help push the depth of field. So I'm using this weird maple leaf brush, and I'm manipulating what I've laid out on the canvas to try to squash and make it fit. And then I'm actually going to go in and do a little bit of painting on that. Because obviously this doesn't look like it's working so well. So once I have the base for the leaves in, I'm going to go in and start to paint out a little bit of the detail. A lot of this is stuff you're not going to see in the final image, because as soon as I'm happy with where these leaves are, I'm actually going to use the blur tool to blur them out a little bit, just to give a little bit of a depth of field, as I mentioned earlier. So where you can find the blur function is under filter, scroll down to blur. I used Gaussian blur on this, and then you just select how extreme you want that blur to be for whatever item you're using or whatever item you intend to blur. So I was happy with the hand, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized that it looked really bizarre. I liked it at first, and I liked it almost throughout the entire piece, but then I realized it looked weird. So I go in, I try to manipulate the anatomy as best I can, but then I just end up changing the whole thing and repainting it from scratch, as you'll see in a moment. So in order to separate the main foreground gnome and the owl, I'm adding a little bit of a rim light in here, even though I don't think the light is really going to hit him that way. It looks all right to me, and it does help to separate those two characters out. So sometimes inventing light where there is none might help solve a problem that you have while you're working on your illustrations. Here, as I mentioned, I'm going in and repainting that hand completely from scratch. So I just started a new normal layer and laid out a basic outline for it, and then just started painting it like I would normally. As much as I enjoyed that other hand, it just wasn't working out well enough. So painting a new hand from scratch is super, super easy in Photoshop. Right about here, I realized I was a little bit off model from the original design of my character, where he was supposed to have these gauntlets. So again, just like manipulating the hand or repainting the hand, it's just a simple matter of adding another normal layer on top and just painting out the details that were intended to be there in the first place. Here I'm going in on a color dodge layer with a soft brush and just emphasizing some of those highlights, the backlighting from behind the trees and the magical effect coming from the little girl, just to push the magical feel of the piece overall, and wind down on wrapping this piece up. So as we wind down on another episode of The First Step, I want to thank you all for tuning in, for sticking with it, and for following me along on the process I used to paint this image. As a reminder, this piece will be featured along with 99 other amazing artists at the Sketchpad Gallery in San Francisco on the 11th of March from 4 to 8 p.m. So if you're in the area and you want to see a whole bunch of cool art, please stop by. The Sketchpad Gallery is a great place to see some great art. My name is Gary Labe. Thank you for tuning into The First Step, and we will see you all next week.